In the vast expanse of the Pacific, where the ocean's blue was punctuated only by the scattered atolls and the stark white of crashing waves, the skies bore witness to a dance of death and valor during World War II. This tale unfolds in the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a Japanese aircraft that soared through the heavens with a grace and agility that belied the ferocity of its purpose. As dawn broke on December 7, 1941, the tranquility of Pearl Harbor was shattered. A formation of Zeros, sleek and deadly, descended from the morning haze. Lieutenant Kenji Kato, a seasoned pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy, guided his Zero with practiced ease, the rising sun emblem emblazoned on the fuselage, gleaming under the Hawaiian sun. His mission was clear and his resolve unwavering. The Americans would be caught off guard, their Pacific fleet vulnerable. Kato and his comrades executed their attack with precision, their Zeros darting through enemy fire like specters. The harbor, a picture of peacetime lethargy just moments before, erupted into chaos. Battleships smoldered, and the air was thick with the acrid tang of burning oil and metal. The Zero's initial triumph was emblematic of the Japanese air strategy, swift, sudden, and utterly devastating. But the prowess of the Zero was not merely a product of surprise or numerical superiority. It was born of a philosophy that prized maneuverability above all. Kato's Zero, with its lightweight frame and absence of armor, could perform aerial feats that seemed to defy physics. He had outmaneuvered American Wildcats with ease, watching as enemy pilots, encumbered by their heavier, slower aircraft, struggled to match his agility. Months turned into years, and the tide of war shifted. The vast blue skies, once a tapestry upon which the glory of the Zero was painted, became a stage for its vulnerabilities. At the Battle of Midway, the turning point in the Pacific theater, Kato felt the winds of change. 4 Japanese carriers, symbols of naval might, were lost, and with them, many of the IJN's most experienced pilots. The Zero was no longer the unchallenged lord of the skies. American technological innovation led to the introduction of more formidable fighters, like the F-4U Corsair and the F-6F Hellcat. These aircraft were not only faster, but also sturdier, equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor that allowed American pilots to endure what would have been fatal blows to a Zero. Moreover, America's industrial might churned out these advanced fighters in numbers that Japan could not hope to match. The U.S. also ramped up pilot training, creating a new breed of American aviators who were both well-equipped and numerous. The skies grew increasingly hostile to Kato and his brethren, their Zeros now outmatched and outgunned. Yet it was not merely technology or production that sealed the fate of the Japanese air strategy, but the dwindling reservoir of experienced pilots. Kato witnessed the desperation in the eyes of the young recruits, sent into battle with but a fraction of his training and none of his seasoned calm. The war had become a grim attrition, claiming the skilled and the brave, leaving the inexperienced to flounder in skies that forgave no mistake. In the waning days of the conflict, as the Zero became more relic than threat, Kato often found himself reflecting on the journey from the heights of Pearl Harbor to the desperation of battles fought not for victory, but for mere survival. Each sortie was a reminder of what had been lost, the grace of an era when a Zero pilot could feel like the master of the heavens, now just fleeting memories against the stark realities of war. When Japan finally capitulated in 1945, the story of the Zero did not end in the skies, but in the hearts of those who flew them. The aircraft that had once symbolized the might of the Japanese Empire now stood as a testament to the futility of war, a war where valor and honor were often overshadowed by loss and devastation. As Kato hung up his flight suit for the last time, the silhouette of his Zero against the crimson sunset was not just the closing of a day, but the end of an era. The Pacific lay calm once more, its waters covering the scars of battle, its skies silent witnesses to the courage and the cost of a world at war. The journey of the Mitsubishi. A6M Zero began long before it took to the skies over Pearl Harbor. In the late 1930s, the Japanese Naval General Staff issued a requirement for a new fighter aircraft. The specifications were demanding. The new plane had to be fast, highly maneuverable, and capable of operating over long distances. The design team, led by Jiro Horikoshi at Mitsubishi, rose to the challenge. The Zero's design was revolutionary. It featured a lightweight airframe, which was achieved by using new aluminum alloys that provided strength without the burden of extra weight. The aircraft's sleek aerodynamic design reduced drag, allowing it to reach speeds that surpassed many of its contemporaries. But it was the Zero's exceptional range that truly set it apart. With drop tanks, the Zero could reach distances that made it a formidable tool for Japan's island-hopping strategy. Kato remembered the first time he saw the Zero. He was a young pilot then, part of the cadre selected to test the new aircraft. The first flight was a revelation. The Zero responded to his slightest touch, its control surfaces nimble and precise. In mock dogfights, he found himself outmaneuvering older, slower aircraft with ease. The Zero's agility seemed almost supernatural, a perfect extension of his will. As war loomed, Kato and his comrades prepared for the battles that would come. The initial campaigns across Southeast Asia and the Pacific saw the Zero at the forefront of Japan's aerial assaults. The aircraft's long range allowed it to accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, providing cover and clearing the skies of opposition. Kato's squadron was among the first to strike at the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Each sortie added to the legend of the Zero. Allied aircraft, often outdated and poorly maintained, were no match for the speed and firepower of the Japanese fighters. The Allies, caught off guard by the Zero's capabilities, scrambled to adapt. One of Kato's most vivid memories from these early days was a dogfight over the Philippines. He and his wingmen encountered a flight of American P-40 Warhawks. The ensuing battle was a blur of twisting, turning aircraft, tracers lighting up the sky. Kato's Zero seemed to dance through the chaos, his guns finding their mark with deadly precision. By the end of the engagement, several P-40s had been shot down, and the rest were fleeing. It was a clear victory, but Kato knew that each success brought them closer to the inevitable counterpunch from the Allies. The early dominance of the Zero was not to last. As the war progressed, the Allies began to develop tactics and technologies to counter the Japanese fighter. American pilots learned to exploit the Zero's weaknesses, its lack of armor and vulnerable fuel tanks. They adapted hit-and-run tactics, using their more robust aircraft to deliver punishing blows and then disengage before the nimble Zeros could retaliate. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a pivotal moment. Kato's squadron was part of the massive Japanese force aiming to lure the American carriers into a trap. However, the Americans, having broken Japanese codes, were prepared. The battle turned into a disaster for Japan, with 4 of its carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sunk. The loss of these carriers was a strategic blow, but the loss of experienced pilots was an even greater tragedy. Kato survived Midway, but many of his friends and comrades did not. The death toll among the pilots was staggering, and the replacements were green, hastily trained, and lacking the combat experience that had given the early Zero pilots their edge. The veteran pilots, like Kato, were now tasked with the nearly impossible job of leading these inexperienced men into battle. In response to the changing dynamics of the war, the Japanese command sought to bolster the capabilities of their air force. However, the industrial might of the United States made it difficult for Japan to keep pace. American factories were producing vast numbers of new, advanced aircraft, while Japanese production struggled to maintain output amidst resource shortages and bombings. New American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair were formidable adversaries. These planes could outclimb, outgun, and outlast the Zeros. They were faster, had more powerful engines, and carried heavier armament. Additionally, the self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating made them much more survivable in combat. Kato's encounters with these new American planes were harrowing. The first time he faced a Hellcat, he was struck by its sheer power. The American pilot flew with a confidence that came from knowing his aircraft could take hits that would have downed a Zero. The dogfight was intense, and Kato had to draw on all his skill to evade the Hellcat's guns. He managed to escape, but the encounter left him shaken. As the war dragged on, the situation for the Japanese Air Force grew increasingly dire. Fuel shortages became chronic, and the quality of pilot training deteriorated. The young pilots Kato flew with were brave, but they lacked the finesse and experience that had characterized the early Zero aces. Each mission became a grim gamble, with fewer and fewer returning home. One particularly devastating mission was the defense of the Marianas in mid-1944. Kato and his squadron were tasked with repelling an overwhelming American offensive aimed at securing these strategically vital islands. The skies over the Marianas became a crucible of fire and steel as the Japanese desperately tried to hold their ground. The American pilots were relentless, their new Hellcats and Corsairs swarming like angry hornets. Kato, leading a formation of young, inexperienced pilots, knew the odds were against them. As they climbed to intercept the incoming wave of American bombers and fighters, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The battle was brutal. Kato's Zero darted through the melee, his guns blazing as he took aim at the enemy. He saw one of his young wingmen go down in flames, the pilot barely having had a chance to prove himself. The American planes seemed to be everywhere, their superior firepower and armor making them nearly invincible. Kato's Zero, nimble and agile, was still a deadly weapon, but it was increasingly clear that the tide had turned irreversibly. Kato managed to score a few hits, sending a Hellcat spiraling down into the ocean below. But for every victory, there were countless losses. His fuel was running low, and he knew he had to return to base. As he pulled away from the fray, he saw the devastation below. The Japanese positions were crumbling, and the Marianas would soon fall into American hands. With the war nearing its tragic conclusion, Japan resorted to desperate measures. The Kamikaze campaign, where pilots deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships, was born out of necessity and a grim resolve to inflict as much damage as possible on the advancing American fleet. Kato, now a senior pilot, was horrified by the strategy, but understood the desperation that drove it. The Kamikaze pilots, many of them young and idealistic, were willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. Kato watched as these young men, with barely any combat experience, were sent on one-way missions. The Zero, stripped of its guns and loaded with explosives, became a flying bomb. The once proud aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air superiority was now a tool of last resort. Kato never participated in a kamikaze mission himself. His role was to train and prepare the young pilots for their final flights. He tried to instill in them the skills and tactics that might give them a chance to reach their targets, but he knew that few would return. Each farewell was a solemn reminder of the war's brutality and the heavy toll it exacted. As 1945 dawned, Japan's situation grew increasingly desperate. The American forces were closing in on the Japanese mainland, and the relentless bombings of Japanese cities left the nation in ruins. Kato's airbase, once bustling with activity, was now a shadow of its former self. Supplies were scarce, and morale was at an all-time low. Kato flew fewer and fewer missions as the war drew to a close. The once mighty Zero, now outdated and outmatched, struggled to make an impact against the overwhelming American air and naval power. The skies were no longer a place of glory, but a domain of survival. One of Kato's last missions was a futile attempt to intercept a massive American bomber raid over Tokyo. The sight of hundreds of B-29 superfortresses darkening the sky was awe-inspiring and terrifying. Kato and his remaining comrades launched into the air, knowing they had little chance of stopping the bombers. The Americans had air superiority, and the Japanese fighters were swatted aside like flies. Kato Zero was hit by anti-aircraft fire and shrapnel from exploding bombs. He managed to limp back to base, his plane barely holding together. As he landed, the realization set in that the war was lost. Japan was on the brink of surrender, and the once proud Zero had become a relic of a bygone era. When Japan finally capitulated in August 1945, the war's end brought a mixture of relief and sorrow. Kato, like many of his surviving comrades, faced the daunting task of rebuilding his life in a nation shattered by war. The memories of those harrowing years, the friends lost, and the battles fought, remained etched in his mind. The story of the Zero, from its triumphant early days to its desperate final missions, was a testament to the highs and lows of wartime aviation. The aircraft had been a symbol of Japanese innovation and prowess, its pilots revered as elite warriors. But the relentless march of technology and the brutal realities of total war had revealed the limitations of even the most advanced machines. In the post-war years, Kato became a commercial pilot, flying for a civilian airline. The skills he had honed in combat served him well in peacetime, and he found solace in the skies once more. Yet, the shadow of the war never fully lifted. Each flight was a reminder of the journeys taken in a Zero, the battles fought, and the lives lost. The Pacific skies, once a battleground, now remain silent witnesses to the courage and the cost of a world at war. The legacy of the Zero and its pilots endures, a testament to a time when the fate of nations was decided in the azure expanse above, and the valor of those who flew remains etched in history's annals. Thank you all for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye and see you again.